Hello and welcome. Has Iran's leading opposition figure, Mir Hossein Mousavi, reached the end of the line? Well, after weeks of protests, the country's Guardian Council has ruled in favor of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. The expected move by Iran's top legislative body has left little room for the opposition candidates and their supporters, who had taken to the streets seeking a new election and reforms. If Mr. Mousavi does not back down and accept the Guardian Council's declaration, he risks imprisonment for himself and his supporters. One alternative he faces is to begin the process of reconciliation, but that may leave him as the much weakened voice of the opposition with little hope of reforming anything. After staging the largest protest since the 1979 revolution, is the opposition willing to give up altogether, or could there be another scenario in Iran? On today's show, we ask, is this the end of Iran's reformers or the next step in the Iranian revolution? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE and enter the chat room to take part. And we'll, of course, welcome your phone calls on the show too. Joining me now is an Iranian woman who's kept a close eye on developments in her country, having left a dozen years ago as freedoms for women started to disappear. Azar Nafisi wrote the best-selling book Reading Lolita in Tehran, illustrating the unique perspective of women in the country. Beyond her award-winning writing, Dr. Nafisi is Executive Director of Cultural Conversations at Johns Hopkins University. In her most recent book, Things I've Been Silent About, she details her coming of age against the background of Iran's political revolution. As a young professor, Dr. Nafisi joined the 1979 cultural movement that followed the Islamic Revolution and soon became disillusioned with the new leadership in Iran and the restrictions it placed on the country's women. Dr. Nafisi, good to have you on the show.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Let's start off by getting your take on what's happening in Iran. Is it the end of the line for the reformers, really?
I don't think it's the end of the line. For the past 30 years, there have been protests and movements, and each time this question has come up. As far as I'm concerned, the question has always been negative. You remember at the end of Mr. Khatami's two terms, everyone thought that people have gone home now and things will be back to what the Islamic Republic wants it to be. And that didn't happen.
Now, in terms of the way things have gone now, you were involved in Iran's 1979 revolution with support, at least, for the cultural revolution, which removed the Shah. And you took part in many of those cultural protests that occurred after the revolution. How did you envisage Iran would turn out?
Well, at that time, Iran was a modern country with many firm, modern, pluralistic social institutions. I felt that the political oppression that was imposed on the society was far behind the country's social and cultural progress. And so we went into the streets asking for more rights. Ironically, what we got was less.
Yeah, I was going to say, because you've said that people who voted for the Islamic Revolution didn't know what they were voting for, and that in actual fact it's part of the problem with these types of movements. Yes. Now, couldn't that apply to the logic of the protesters now, that they don't really know what they're doing?
Well, one difference, of course, is that Iranian people have undergone 30 years of this regime, and they have changed their tactics. Each time the movement has become maturer. You see the Iranian women, everybody is amazed at them. For 30 years, they have been doing very slow work against the repressive laws, trying to educate the people and becoming educated themselves. So this is a different movement. It's a cumulative one rather than a sudden one.
Have you, I mean, you protested against the Shah's regime. Have you been involved in any of the protests now for this latest?
Well, unfortunately, the latest events, I was not in Iran, but as much as one can be involved, both in heart and mind, yes, definitely.
Yeah, because Iranians did protest around the world as well.
Iranians protested against the world, and fortunately, not all channels of communication were broken. So I had been from day one, as many other Iranians, in touch with the people who were protesting in the streets, friends, relatives, former students.
Now, we have a chat room that goes on online as we go online, and it's the live station chat room. A question came in from Rumpel in Canada, who says, do you think there is any way back for the Iranian government now that so many people have taken to the streets and there has been so much violence?
You know, I think that Iranian government has placed itself in a very difficult position. Had they not reacted so violently and so absolutely to the protesters, they might have left themselves some room to maneuver. If Mr. Ahmadinejad manages to suppress everyone, still this presidency will be forever stained and not legitimate, not just in the eyes of the Iranian people, but also in the eyes of the world, and it will be a very weakened presidency.
It seems to be much more than just about the failure of Mr. Mousavi winning the election. It seems to be the people are sending a greater message to.
Oh, definitely.
The rulers.
You know, during elections, usually they're open spaces for different strata of Iranian people to voice what they want. And usually the candidate they choose as one of Mr. Khatami's supporters and influential supporters of Mr. Mousavian, Hajarian said, he said people not so much voted for Khatami, but they voted against the system. Right. And right now the demands go further than just Mr. Mousavi. And that is, I think, what frightens many people within the system.
Again, another question from our live station chat room from the UK, and John is asking, is Mousavi the right person to lead the people's movement? Do you think this movement lacks vision and leadership?
Well, I think that one of the problems has been that the movement has been leading Mr. Mousavi. I mean, in many ways he has been more passive and responding to either Mr. Ahmadinejad's side or to the protesters who constantly have kept him on his toes. In fact, his wife, Mrs. Rahnavard, has been more active. So I think that is a weakness. One thing that gives people hope is that up to now he has not retreated.
We've got a caller on the line from the UK. Amir, what would you like to ask?
Well, I would like to ask why all the media in the world are showing only one side of the story. The whole world knows that Mr. Ahmadinejad got the most votes in this election. But majority of the women which are saying their rights have been taken away. The only thing that they have asked Iranian women, just follow the Islamic rule, just wear a scarf. And some people, they have just taken this too much, more than what it is. Amir,
let me ask Dr. Nafisi this. This is a comment we've had from a number of viewers saying, look, you're showing only, or the media, the world media, is showing only one side. Of course, initially, when there were protests on both sides, they were visible, and I guess the media focused on the violence that took place, which of course affected the opposition protesters. But could it be a valid question? Why is everyone focused on just the opposition?
Well, of course, it's a valid question. One point about the media is that media goes where the news is. When Mr. Ahmadinejad was in New York, he was getting more coverage than Brad Pitt was, you know, and
although I don't think it was favourable coverage.
but you know, all the major anchors on different networks were interviewing him, and you know, they weren't hostile towards him. In fact, they could have asked many more questions, which were, I think, valid in regards to what was happening in Iran. And at that point, everybody was saying, why not the voice of other people? Right. And another thing is that Iranian state has sort of monopolized everything. There is nothing on Iranian state media about what is happening in the streets of Tehran. And I don't think that media has been showing any bias. They are showing what they see and what they are, of course, allowed to see.
As the main stories.
Yes.
Yeah. A question that came in via Facebook, if I could put this to you, from Yasmin Yusuf, who sent this to us. Yasmin says, do you believe the demonstrations will die out, or will things really change like they did during the revolution? Many argue that this situation is similar to 1979. Is this true?
You know, there are always some similarities, but everything is different now. So I don't think that we can just go back in time and say this is exactly 1979. Every time there has been protest, every time people have come to the streets, although they have been put down and suppressed, something had changed forever. So what is happening in Iran is cumulative. And every time people come, there are more people joining, there are more unity among the protesters. And one more important thing, there is more division within the ruling elite in Iran. And I think that in itself is very important.
I'll try and touch on that in a moment, but interesting you talk about how things have changed. I guess in 1979 there was no situation that reflected, for example, the rallying cry behind the shooting death of Neda Agha Sultan.
No, and she immediately, of course, became a symbol. The whole Neda has now become a symbol, the way the anonymous man in Tiananmen Square in front of the tank became. And this shows how the movement is changing, and that these demonstrations are not the last word.
Although, ironically, President Ahmadinejad has called for an investigation into her death, saying that it was suspicious that it's been made to look like it's the government.
Well, you see, at some point the Iranian government should stop blaming everybody else and should look into itself honestly. I mean, to talk about the fact that the bullet was fired by CIA, at first they tried to say that Neda herself was a CIA agent. These are all signs of weakness. They're not signs of strength.
We're going to take a very short break here. I'm going to ask you many more questions in a moment, but as we pause, let me remind you, you can join the conversation with your questions and comments by logging on to livestation.com and entering the chat room. You can see the debates taking place there right now. We'll be right back.